Well, welcome to week 2, and in week 2 we look at a number of important issues. In fact, we actually cover quite a lot of material, and the reason we need to do that is so that we can all talk the same language and we know about when we say particular terms what they mean, and it starts to make sense. Last week was very much the introductory lecture. What I hope you've noticed is sort of the difference between the civil and the criminal law and the difference between the civil and criminal standards of proof. And that could account for some of the anomalies which you may have perceived in people being acquitted and then subsequently found liable for civil wrongs. That was one of the points we talked about in the lecture. This week we look at the sources of law, that's where law comes from, and that's followed by virtually the potted history of Australia since European settlement and the development of the Australian political institutions, namely the federal parliament and state parliaments, and respective law-making capacities of those bodies. Essentially, the terms we look at for sources of law are common law, which is the law found in the decisions of judges, and is reported in the law reports. It's actually not spelt out precisely. It's actually extracted from the judgment person's interpretation. We look at statute law, which is the law found in Acts of Parliament, delegated legislation, which is the law found in regulations which administrative government departments make, also laws which relate to customs, and more recently the law which flows from international agreements, because these days where governments become parties to international agreements, it can actually affect the local laws of that country, especially if certain of the local laws run counter to the international agreement. The other thing we look at is the history of the law-making powers of the state governments. So essentially what you need to understand is that when European settlement began in Australia back in 1788, the laws they brought with them were the laws of England at that time, and they applied them according to how they would fit in with what was a penal colony, which was basically a lot of convicts and mainly prison officers and military personnel guarding the convicts. So it wasn't exactly the same as the laws of England. The other thing they decided at that stage effectively was that even if they didn't recognise the customary law of the indigenous population, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, but essentially it was sort of the indigenous population didn't have built structures, they didn't have a written language as such, so the first settlers simply applied the laws of England. A number of colonies grew up, New South Wales and Victoria, Queensland, and they were all eventually got varying degrees of self-government, and the head of state was, in each one was a governor who reported back to the Crown in the UK. So essentially Australia was, up until Federation, a series of colonies, each under the dominion of a governor. The colonies had power to make laws for all sorts of matters. They had basically the original lawmaking power, and there were some restrictions. They couldn't make laws which ran counter to the laws of the Imperial Parliament in certain areas, namely to do with foreign relations. However, they had all the power to make the laws. It was only at Federation where the colonies were prepared to hand over some of their lawmaking powers to this new parliament called the Commonwealth or Federal Parliament, and those powers were spelt out expressly in a document called the Constitution. So what we had was the Federal Parliament had powers to make laws in relation to interstate trade, international relations, customs and excise, and there's a whole lot of areas in which it had the power to make the laws spelt out in Section 51 of the Constitution. The states retained their law-making capacity in other areas. So we had what was called the division of powers. The law-making powers were divided between the states and the Commonwealth. There was also an area where both the states and the Commonwealth had power to make the law, and they were areas of concurrent power. And we look at what happens when both the Commonwealth and the state make a law in an area of concurrent power. And the effect of that is basically that under Section 109 of the Constitution, the federal law prevails over the state law. The last issue we look at is how governments work and theories of government briefly, and we look at what's called the separation of powers. That's a different doctrine to the division of powers. This idea of the separation of powers was developed by Baron Montesquieu, a French lawyer many years ago, and in an ideal system to create a balance of power, we have three branches of government: the legislature, which makes the law, that's the Parliament; the executive, which implements and administers the law, that's called the executive; and the judiciary, which interprets and applies the law in areas of dispute. Now, basically, the executive is the ministers of the Crown government departments. In Australia, we don't have a complete separation of powers, because our cabinet ministers are also members of the legislature. Now, I think I've given you quite a potted history of this week's lecture, and I'll leave it at that for the time being. I'll catch up with you again next week.